Picture this. December 3rd, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, eastern France. 4 American soldiers from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment huddle in a foxhole as artillery screams overhead. Private First Class Daniel Cooper, age 19, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Private Michael Rossi, 21, Brooklyn born and raised. Corporal James Walker, 23, a farm boy from Mississippi. And Private Thomas Hayes, barely 18, from a small town in Oregon nobody's heard of. They'd volunteered for one last patrol before their unit pulled back for winter rotation. A routine sweep of the forest perimeter, 2 hours maximum, back before nightfall. At 15:30 hours, they radioed their position. 3 minutes later, German artillery opened up. And then, silence. For 78 years, those 4 men would remain exactly where they were, frozen in time, waiting to be found. The date is critical. December 1944. The Germans were preparing what would become the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate final offensive through the Ardennes. Allied intelligence had missed the massive buildup of German forces in the forest, and units across the region were conducting reconnaissance to identify enemy positions. Easy Company had been holding a sector near the Belgian border for 3 weeks, enduring constant shelling and small unit engagements that ground down their numbers day by day. Daniel Cooper had been writing letters home every day since landing in Normandy 6 months earlier. His younger sister Eleanor kept everyone, preserving them in a shoebox that would eventually contain 47 letters spanning June through December 1944. The final letter, dated December 2nd, arrived at the Cooper family home in Cedar Rapids on Christmas Eve. "Dear Elle," it began, "tomorrow we're going out one more time before rotation. Just a quick look around the woods. Jimmy says it'll be easy in and out before dinner. After this, they're sending us back for R&R. Maybe I'll be home by spring. Keep the porch light on for me." Eleanor Cooper would keep that porch light burning for 78 years. Michael Rossi had grown up in the streets of Brooklyn, the oldest of 6 children, working as a delivery boy to help support his family before the war. His mother Angela received the telegram in January 1945, the standard War Department notification. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, Private Michael Rossi, has been reported missing in action since the 3rd of December 1944 in France. If further details or other information are received, you will be promptly notified." Angela Rossi would light a candle in the window of their apartment every night until her death in 1983. Neighbors remembered her standing at that window, watching the street below, as if Michael might walk up the steps at any moment. James Walker had enlisted against his father's wishes, leaving behind a cotton farm in Mississippi and a young wife named Dorothy, who was 3 months pregnant when he shipped out. The baby, James Jr., was born in March 1945. He would grow up knowing his father only through photographs and the stories Dorothy would tell him, stories that grew more distant and painful with each year that passed without answers. Walker's father wrote to the War Department 17 times between 1945 and 1962, each letter asking the same question. "Where is my son?" Each response was identical: missing in action, status unchanged, presumed killed. But without a body, without confirmation, the wound never healed. Thomas Hayes was the youngest of the 4, having lied about his age to enlist in 1943. His parents in Oregon received their telegram the same week as the others. But Hayes's mother refused to accept it. She contacted her congressman, wrote to General Eisenhower personally, hired private investigators after the war ended. She spent every dollar the family had searching for answers about what had happened to her son in those French woods. When she died in 1972, her last words to her daughter were instructions. "Don't stop looking. Promise me." The daughter promised. And like the others, she kept searching, kept hoping, kept believing that someday the truth would emerge from the silence that had swallowed 4 young men on that December afternoon. The patrol had left Easy Company's position at 14:30 hours. Their objective was simple: sweep a 2-kilometer section of forest to the northeast, identify any German positions, and return before dark. They carried standard equipment: M1 Garand rifles, grenades, a single radio, and 24 hours of rations. The route would take them through dense woodland, following a small creek that wound through the hills toward the Belgian border. Weather conditions were poor: overcast skies threatening snow, temperatures hovering just above freezing. Perfect conditions for an ambush. According to the radio log maintained by Easy Company's communications officer, Cooper radioed in at 15:30 hours exactly as planned. His transmission was brief and routine. "This is Charlie 7. Position confirmed at coordinates 479238. No enemy contact. Continuing sweep. Over." The communications officer acknowledged and logged the transmission. It was the last anyone would hear from Charlie 7. 3 minutes later, at 15:33 hours, German artillery opened up on Easy Company's main position. A massive barrage that lasted 47 minutes and killed 8 men while wounding 19 others. In the chaos of that bombardment, no one noticed that Charlie 7 hadn't checked in again. By the time the shelling stopped and headcount was taken, it was dark. A relief patrol was dispatched at first light to find Cooper and his squad. The search team, led by Lieutenant Robert Preston, followed Charlie 7's planned route through the forest. They found boot prints in the muddy ground, evidence of 4 men moving in tactical formation. They found spent cartridge casings, cigarette butts, and, at one point, a wrapper from a de-rationed chocolate bar. But approximately 1 kilometer from where Charlie 7 had made their last radio call, the trail simply disappeared. The boot prints ended in a small clearing near the creek. No signs of struggle, no blood, no equipment. It was as if Cooper, Rossi, Walker, and Hayes had been plucked from the earth mid-step. Lieutenant Preston's report, filed on December 5, 1944, listed the 4 men as missing in action and presumed captured or killed by enemy forces. But the report also noted several anomalies that troubled Preston enough to include them, despite knowing they would likely be dismissed as combat stress. The clearing where the trail ended showed evidence of recent artillery impact, but the crater pattern was unusual. Impacts were tightly grouped, suggesting deliberate targeting of a specific location. More disturbing, the surrounding trees showed blast damage inconsistent with standard German artillery. Bark was stripped in spiral patterns and several trunks had burst from the inside out, as if subjected to internal pressure rather than external explosion. Additionally, my men reported a smell in the area that none could identify, described variously as metallic, chemical, and wrong. One private became physically ill and had to be evacuated. I recommend further investigation when tactical situation permits. The tactical situation never permitted. 2 weeks later, the Battle of the Bulge began, and the Ardennes forest erupted into the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would fight in Europe. The German offensive drove Allied units back across Belgium, and the small clearing where Charlie 7 had vanished was overrun. By the time American forces retook the area in January 1945, the ground was churned to mud by tanks and covered in snow that would last until spring. Any evidence that might have existed was destroyed, buried, or scattered beyond recovery. After the war ended, the American Graves Registration Service conducted extensive searches across Europe, locating and identifying remains of soldiers killed in combat. They searched the Ardennes region multiple times between 1946 and 1951, interviewing locals, examining German records, following every lead. They found thousands of missing servicemen, but not Cooper, Rossi, Walker, or Hayes. It was as if they'd never existed, as if that December afternoon in 1944 had erased them from history entirely. The case was officially closed in 1952. The 4 men were declared dead, their names added to the tablets of the missing at the Netherlands American Cemetery. Memorial services were held, families grieved, and gradually, as decades passed, the mystery faded from public attention. It became a footnote in regimental histories, a curiosity mentioned in books about unsolved military disappearances, a story told by aging veterans who'd known the four men and never stopped wondering what had happened to them in those woods. But the mystery never truly disappeared. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, local French farmers in the region reported strange occurrences in the area where Charlie 7 had vanished. Crops wouldn't grow in certain sections of field. Animals refused to graze there. One farmer, a man named Claude Dubois, whose father had hidden resistance fighters during the occupation, claimed he'd found American equipment in the woods in 1958, a helmet with a bullet hole and dog tags that had been partially melted as if exposed to extreme heat. He'd reported it to authorities, but by the time investigators arrived, the items had disappeared. Dubois maintained until his death that someone had taken them, though who and why remained unexplained. In the 1970s, amateur metal detector enthusiasts began searching the Ardennes for war relics, a controversial practice that horrified veterans but attracted treasure hunters from across Europe. Several of these searchers reported equipment malfunctions in a specific area of forest northeast of what had been Easy Company's 1944 position. Metal detectors would spin wildly, compasses would reverse direction, and electronic equipment would fail completely. One group claimed to have found a depression in the ground that looked like an old foxhole but couldn't excavate because their tools, all of them, broke within minutes of beginning work. They marked the location and returned with better equipment but could never find the spot again. The forest seemed to shift, they said. Trails you'd walked the day before would lead somewhere different. Landmarks would appear and disappear. The breakthrough came in 2022, 78 years after Charlie 7's disappearance, from a source completely unrelated to military history or treasure hunting. A French environmental research team from the University of Strasbourg was conducting a survey of the Ardennes forest ecosystem, mapping soil composition and plant growth patterns as part of a climate change study. On August 12, 2022, their ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly. A void space, approximately 2 meters deep and 3 meters across, located in a section of forest that matched the coordinates where Cooper had made his final radio transmission. The researchers initially assumed it was a natural cave or an old mine shaft. But when they excavated carefully, removing layers of soil and accumulated forest debris, what they found stopped them cold. It was a foxhole, a perfectly preserved American foxhole from World War II. And inside it, frozen in time like a photograph, were 4 soldiers in full combat gear, their positions suggesting they'd been waiting for something when whatever happened, happened. The excavation team immediately contacted French military authorities, who in turn notified the American Defense POW/MIA accounting agency. Within 48 hours, the site was secured, cordoned off, and placed under guard. Forensic specialists, military historians, and archaeologists descended on the remote forest clearing, and what they discovered in that foxhole would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the final months of World War II. Because Cooper, Rossi, Walker, and Hayes hadn't just disappeared. They'd been preserved, protected, kept exactly as they were at 15:33 hours on December 3, 1944. And the evidence suggested something extraordinary had occurred in that foxhole, something that had nothing to do with German artillery or combat, something that 78 years of silence had kept hidden, until now. The forensic team approached the foxhole with extreme caution, documenting every layer of soil as they excavated. What emerged from 78 years of accumulated earth was a scene that defied every natural law of decomposition and decay. The foxhole's walls were intact, reinforced with logs exactly as field manuals prescribed. The floor was covered with pine needles and dirt, compressed but still identifiable. And positioned around the interior, frozen in defensive postures, were 4 figures that shouldn't exist in this condition. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead archaeologist from the Defense POWMIA accounting agency, would later describe the discovery in testimony that was immediately classified and only partially released years afterward. They weren't skeletons. They weren't remains in any conventional sense. They were preserved, completely intact, as if they'd been sealed in some kind of stasis. Uniforms showed minimal decay. Equipment was functional. And most disturbing, their expressions, their body positions, everything suggested they'd been caught mid-action. Not killed, not injured, just stopped. Daniel Cooper was positioned at the Foxhole's edge, his M1 Garand rifle raised to his shoulder, aimed at something beyond the hole's rim. His finger was on the trigger. His eyes, impossibly preserved, were wide open. Michael Rossi sat against the rear wall, his hands gripping a radio handset, mouth open as if speaking mid-transmission. James Walker was crouched in the center, a grenade in his hand, pin still attached. And Thomas Hayes was on his knees, both hands pressed against the ground as if bracing against something, his face turned upward toward the sky that had been buried above him for 78 years. The equipment in the Foxhole was examined with growing disbelief. Cooper's rifle, when carefully removed and tested, was still loaded, chamber-ready, mechanism functional despite decades underground. The radio Rossi held, an SCR 300 backpack model, showed no signs of moisture damage or corrosion. When forensic electronics specialists powered it up using period-correct batteries, it functioned perfectly, still tuned to Easy Company's frequency from December 3, 1944. But it was the personal effects that truly shocked the investigators. In Cooper's breast pocket was the photograph of his sister Eleanor that he'd mentioned in his final letter, still perfectly preserved, colors unfaded. Rossi had a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes in his jacket, one cigarette half-smoked, still bearing the impression of lips that had been pressing against it when time stopped. Walker's pocket watch, a gift from his father, was frozen at exactly 15:33 hours, and Hayes had a letter tucked into his helmet liner, written to his mother but never mailed, the ink still wet enough to smudge when touched. Dr. Mitchell's team worked for 6 days documenting the site before attempting to move anything. Ground-penetrating radar scans of the surrounding area revealed something impossible. The Foxhole existed in what could only be described as a bubble, a spherical void in the earth approximately 5 meters in diameter. The soil composition inside the bubble was identical to December 1944, still bearing traces of pollen from plants that had bloomed that year. Outside the bubble, soil showed normal layering, 78 years of seasonal deposits and organic accumulation. But the boundary between them was absolute, as if an invisible barrier had preserved everything within while time continued normally outside. More disturbing were the secondary readings. Electromagnetic sensors detected residual energy signatures within the bubble that matched nothing in their database. Geiger counters showed elevated but non-dangerous radiation levels, but the spectrum was wrong, showing wavelengths that shouldn't exist in natural decay processes. And thermal imaging revealed that the soil inside the bubble was exactly 0.3 degrees warmer than the surrounding Earth, maintaining a temperature differential that had somehow persisted for nearly 8 decades. When the bodies were finally removed on August 24, 2022, under conditions of absolute secrecy, the forensic pathologists made discoveries that challenged every assumption about what had happened in that foxhole. The 4 soldiers weren't dead in any conventional sense. Their tissues showed no decomposition. Blood remained liquid in their veins. And most impossibly, when placed under specialized imaging, their brains showed patterns of electrical activity, minimal, barely detectable, but present, as if they'd been suspended between life and death, caught in some quantum state that defied biology. DNA testing confirmed their identities within hours. Daniel Cooper, Michael Rossi, James Walker, and Thomas Hayes. The families were notified immediately, though what they were told was carefully controlled. Your loved one has been found. Remains will be returned for burial with full military honors. The truth, the real truth about what had been discovered, remained classified at the highest levels of government. But the investigation continued in secret facilities far from the forest where Charlie 7 had been found. The foxhole itself was removed intact, The entire bubble extracted as a single unit and transported to an underground research facility in Virginia. Scientists from multiple disciplines, physicists, biologists, temporal mechanics specialists whose existence was officially denied, studied the phenomenon that had preserved 4 soldiers for 78 years. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Dr. James Chen, a theoretical physicist working on classified projects related to temporal anomalies, recognized patterns in the energy signatures. They matched theoretical predictions for what would happen if matter were subjected to intense gravitational shear at a quantum level. Not a black hole, but something similar. A localized distortion in spacetime that had essentially frozen everything within its influence, creating a pocket where time moved differently, or perhaps didn't move at all. But what could create such an effect in 1944? The Manhattan Project was still 2 years from producing the atomic bomb. No nation possessed technology capable of generating the kind of energy required for temporal manipulation. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had happened in that foxhole at precisely 15:33 hours on December 3, 1944. Something that had stopped time itself. The answer came from recovered German documents, captured from archives in Berlin and only recently declassified under pressure from historians studying the period. Among thousands of pages of mundane military correspondence was a single report filed by a Wehrmacht signals intelligence unit operating in the Ardennes region in late 1944. The report described an anomalous radio transmission intercepted at 15:32 hours on December 3rd. The transmission wasn't on any known military frequency. It wasn't in any recognizable code. It was simply a carrier wave, pure electromagnetic radiation at a frequency that shouldn't have been possible to generate with 1944 technology. The signal lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then it terminated, and simultaneously, every radio within a 2-kilometer radius failed completely. German operators reported equipment burning out, capacitors exploding, vacuum tubes shattering. The report noted the epicenter of the effect as coordinates that precisely matched where Charlie 7's Foxhole was discovered 78 years later. But the report also contained a footnote added by an unknown analyst and marked with a classification stamp that indicated it had been seen by someone at the highest levels of German military intelligence. Recommend immediate investigation. Signal characteristics match theoretical predictions from Project Kronos. If Americans have developed similar technology, strategic implications are catastrophic. Project Kronos. The name appeared in no other German wartime documents. It existed in no Allied intelligence reports. But post-war interrogations of captured German scientists, conducted by Operation Paperclip officers and sealed until 2015, revealed fragments of information. Kronos had been a theoretical research program buried deep within the bureaucracy of the SS Research Division, exploring the possibility of temporal manipulation for military applications. The program had been terminated in 1943, officially because the theoretical framework was impossible. The energy requirements were beyond any conceivable technology. But what if the research hadn't been entirely theoretical? What if someone, either German or Allied, had tested something in the Ardennes in December 1944? What if Charlie 7 had been in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time when an experiment went catastrophically wrong? Dr. Mitchell's final report, submitted in November 2022 and immediately classified at a level above top secret, concluded with a recommendation that sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. The preservation of Charlie 7 suggests technology that shouldn't exist. Either we're dealing with experimental weapons from 1944 that were far more advanced than historical records indicate, or we're dealing with something else entirely. Something that appeared in the Ardennes forest for 3 seconds in December 1944 and left 4 American soldiers suspended between moments. I recommend full investigation of all wartime programs related to advanced physics, both Allied and Axis. And I recommend we consider the possibility that what happened to Cooper, Rossi, Walker, and Hayes wasn't an accident or a weapon. It was contact. The families of the 4 soldiers were given partial closure in early 2023. Funeral services were held with full military honors. Caskets, sealed for reasons the families were told involved preservation of remains, were buried in ceremonies attended by high-ranking officials and surviving members of Easy Company. Eleanor Cooper, now 97 years old, finally turned off the porch light that had burned for 78 years. Angela Rossi's candle was extinguished by her granddaughter. James Walker Jr., now 78 himself, wept at his father's graveside. And Thomas Hayes's sister fulfilled the promise she'd made to her mother 50 years earlier. But what lay in those caskets wasn't bodies. The 4 soldiers of Charlie 7 remained in the research facility in Virginia, still preserved in their impossible state, still exhibiting minimal brain activity that suggested they weren't quite dead. And around them, scientists continued to study the phenomenon that had caught them, trying to understand what had reached into the Ardennes forest on a December afternoon and left 4 young men suspended in a moment that never ended. The Foxhole itself remained intact, maintained in controlled conditions, the temporal bubble still active despite being removed from its original location. Instruments continued to record the anomalous readings that defied conventional physics. And occasionally, very occasionally, the radio that Michael Rossi had been gripping for 78 years would crackle with static. Just for a moment. Just long enough for technicians to scramble to recording equipment. But whatever message it might be trying to receive remained locked in a moment that existed somewhere between 1944 and forever. In the Ardennes forest, where 4 soldiers had vanished into mystery, the French government placed a memorial stone. A simple marker acknowledging that American soldiers had disappeared in this location during the war. Tourists photograph it. Local guides tell sanitized versions of the story. And every December 3rd, at exactly 15:33 hours, a ceremony is held by veterans organizations to honor the missing. But those who know the truth, the handful of scientists and officials who've seen what was found in that foxhole, understand that Charlie 7 never truly went missing. They're still there, frozen in the moment of their last patrol, caught between seconds in a bubble of stopped time, still waiting for orders that will never come, still holding defensive positions against an enemy that wasn't German, wasn't human, and might not even exist in the conventional sense. Daniel Cooper's sister kept his final letter framed beside the photograph of his funeral. She read it every night before bed until her death in 2024, always pausing at the line he'd written. "Keep the porch light on for me." She'd kept that promise for 78 years. But sometimes, in her final days, she would wonder if somewhere, in some way she couldn't understand, her brother was still out there in those French woods, still on patrol, still believing he'd be home by spring. Time, it turns out, isn't as simple as moving from past to future. Sometimes it loops, sometimes it stops, and sometimes 4 young soldiers step into a clearing in the Ardennes forest and never step out, caught forever in a moment that was never meant to last, but somehow never ended. The truth about Charlie 7 remains classified. The research continues in facilities that officially don't exist. And in the Ardennes, the forest keeps its secrets, hiding evidence of the impossible beneath ordinary trees and ordinary earth. Waiting for the next discovery, the next revelation, the next moment when someone realizes that what we think we know about reality, about time, about the war that shaped the 20th century, is just a comfortable lie hiding truths far stranger and more terrifying than any history book has ever dared to record. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.